Welcome to the Objective Recovery Podcast, where we talk about mental health and substance use very open-mindedly. Today we will talk about psychedelics, a topic that has created lots of controversies and debates in the past few years. My guest is Adam Miezio, a writer in the psychedelics field, thanks to his lifelong psychedelic journeying and plant medicine work. He lives in Oaxaca, Mexico, and enjoys exploring mental health, psychedelics, psychology, shamanism, and fringe ideas about consciousness. Thank you for taking the time for this chat, Adam.
I'm honored to be here, Henrietta. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate the invitation.
So how did you get into the psychedelics field in the first place? Can you share a bit about that?
Well, I first started doing and using psychedelics when I was 18 years old in college. So I've been using psychedelics for a long, long time now. And then fast forward to, I think it was 2020, and my life was in flux, much like everyone else's in the world. And I was in an industry, I was working in the home gym equipment industry, and then I had an interesting phenomenon happen. I was integrating after my second ayahuasca retreat. It was about a week or 10 days later, and somebody reached out to me on LinkedIn. I wasn't even psychedelic public on LinkedIn yet, and I saw a person look at my profile. They didn't message me, and it was somebody who worked for MAPS. And I was like, whoa, what's going on here? So I had to message them back, and I said, by chance, why did you look at my profile? And they happened to be looking for somebody to create content for them. So that is how I got into the psychedelics field. It was by, cosmic random design and synchronicity, and that was 5 years ago. And I said, wow, I can actually maybe work in this space now and be actually performing my cosmic job. So it was a really, really cool way to get into this field of work, because I like to think that instead of me choosing psychedelics, psychedelics chose me.
So it's interesting because my interest started more than 20 years ago when I just stumbled upon it when I lived in London a long time ago in the UK, and at the time, again, over 2 decades ago, mushrooms, magic mushrooms were legal there, and we could buy them on the market and in stores and everything. So I was just out with a friend of mine, and we were just looking at, walking around in the market. There were stands selling these mushrooms, and we had no clue. I had absolutely no clue about psychedelics at the time. And so we were just asking the people who were selling it, what is it? And they just started telling us that, magic mushrooms, and we can have visions, and none of us believed it actually. And it's really, I kind of heard about it because I read about psychedelics and culture and shamanic culture. I was very into that actually in a period in my late teens, early 20s, but that was it. So when I first came across, I had no clue, and then we bought a box because it was so cheap. Went back home and then took it and ate it, and then we had an experience. And luckily, it just happened to be a very, very relaxed, very nice environment, and we both had a very good experience, and that's how it started. And for a while, I kept going back to those stores when I lived there and tried different species and different versions. And then it got banned actually shortly, not long after I moved out of the UK. What do you see as the biggest potential of psychedelics these days for the individual user and for the community, society?
So this theme, obviously, lately is psychedelics for healing, which is great, fantastic. I think that's wonderful. Everybody should have access to healing and an opportunity to heal. And at the same time, our current cultural or social framework or context of psychedelics is healing. And about 30 or more years or so ago, when I started using psychedelics, this healing therapeutic framework didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I come from a much different set of psychedelics. I think we almost have to go back to the future. Because something I talk about is trauma. And the last I researched, there's 200 million people with trauma in the United States alone. I don't think there's enough plant medicine or psychedelics in the world to treat 200 million people. I could be wrong, but you get the idea.
And that's likely to be actually a gross underestimate, because it's based on self-report what we know.
I think it's a beautiful thing that this healing framework and context has emerged. We definitely need that. There's no doubt about it. Not only on an individual level, but on a collective and social level as well. However, I think it can be a potential pitfall and a very big risk as well, because and this is how these two tie together, from individual to a society collective level. We can look back and take a lesson from meditation and yoga. About 10 years or so ago, maybe longer, corporate America started co-opting yoga and meditation and offering it in the workplace. Do yoga or meditation at lunch. This looks great for companies in corporate America, because who doesn't look at employee wellness and think, oh, wow, that's really nice for the company to do. However, there's a subtle message beneath the surface of that can be very insidious, which is that the employee has to do yoga and meditation because the employee, you are maladjusted to the system.
Yeah.
You have a problem adjusting to the system. And there's a real danger in that, because then now, let's fast forward and kind of look at it through this psychedelic lens. The same risk can happen with psychedelics and healing and trauma now. Because if we don't step back and gain some perspective and take a bigger look, a bigger picture at what's going on in the world, then the same thing I think can play out. Is that if we all keep healing from our trauma on an individual level, there becomes a subtle, insidious message that says you are maladjusted. The system isn't bad. The system's working fine. You're the problem. And I think that's a real issue, because right now I feel there's not enough conversations unfolding in this space across different aspects of the world we're living in. One of the people that talks about this is 𝘁mě𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗀. I think he said something along the lines of, you can't separate health, spirituality, and politics. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think that's what we have to go, how we have to go back to the future. I think, yes, let's heal, but we could do two things at the same time. What I say is heal and reveal. I come from the era when psychedelics were about revealing, about kind of seeing through the veil of the matrix, or lifting the veil off the matrix and kind of seeing the pitfalls of the systems that we live under, and kind of like seeing the man. That used to be a popular slang word 20 or 30 years ago. And I think we need to bring that back, because right now, as I see it, psychedelics in general, maybe psychedelic therapy, is a finger in the dike. If there's 200 million people with trauma, we're never going to be able to heal them all with psychedelics. The psychedelics are a reactive solution. We have to find also a proactive solution to stop the flow, the surge, the manifestation of this trauma. And that can be done through psychedelics. It can help you see through the lies, the deceptions, the illusions of the society, the structures, the governments that we live in that actually are causing this trauma. And I think it's actually quite necessary.
Yeah, and I agree. And in terms of the system, I think what is going on now is that there is a lot of blame shifting, and people talk about blaming the systems, and a lot of it that is true. And but we also have to look at ourselves, and that's where psychedelics can come in. To investigate ourselves, to look inside, and we can't really ask the system to look as a system, to look inside itself in that way, it's just symbolically we ask, but not directly. And so we have to approach it on the individual level. One aspect is that we should not blame ourselves for our own trauma. So we need to recognize that, develop self-love, self-acceptance, all that. But at the same time, I think sometimes it goes a bit too far, because then people then start really, finding all these problems outside, and then shifting blame and not taking responsibility. And I think I had one therapist who was constantly encouraging me to literally blame others for my difficult experiences. And I immediately said that, no, I'm not going to do that. I disagree. And that's not going to help. If there is not enough psychedelics, so that's not an ultimate solution. How can we still use psychedelics or psychedelic experiences to learn from that, as lessons, to integrate them into systemic knowledge and to change, to reform the system?
I think there's a lot of ways to do that. I personally like a particular lens because my academic background is in mass media persuasion and propaganda. I have that's what my master's is in. And so I'm very, very clued in to the media environment and the news and what we're shown on television. It's terrifying because, at least in the United States, a lot of it is propaganda. I say that we're the most propagandized country in the world. I don't know if that's true or not. I definitely think we're at least in the top 5, if not higher. And a lot of people don't realize that. Maybe they might have an idea, but then they may not admit to it, because how does the Mark Twain line go? It's easier to fool a person than convince them they've been fooled. A lot of people have shame and embarrassment to admit that they've been conned. And I'm the same. I'm human. I've been conned, but it will really improve your life the first time you can admit you've been scammed or conned. And I think we have to raise our consciousness, at least in this aspect of our lives and in terms of systems and governments, to really start distrusting a lot of the narratives of the 20th century we've been conditioned to believe. Because I just said this, I think, on an earlier post of yours on LinkedIn, we're living in this era of great revealing, which is very, very fascinating. It seems that a lot of sunlight is illuminating past lies, deceits, and deceptions of the 20th century. And so I think psychedelics can help us through this process to show us that what we've been taught, what we've been conditioned to believe, a lot of it isn't true. And because of that, those lies have built these systems, these societies, these governments that are actually creating a lot of the trauma and not serving the people. And so I think psychedelics can not only show us that, but they can give us the courage to look at the darkness. I think that's a big problem too, because I think on a collective societal level, there's a big possibility of spiritual bypassing. Of, on a societal level, not looking at horrible, horrible things happening in our countries, our governments, our societies, and saying we don't need to talk about that. And that's a big problem to prevent progress and human evolution, is this massive, like, societal level spiritual bypassing. And I think psychedelics can give us the courage to investigate those things.
Yeah, I recently have talked a lot about spiritual bypassing myself, or spiritual psychosis even. I just made a post this morning on LinkedIn, and because I think that it's like everything, most things in life, right? So we have to find actually, if we are seeking truth, then then really, what is really the truth. And it's so easy to get carried away, and some of it is coming, if we use psychedelics for it, it's coming directly from the effects of those substances, and then how people integrate it into their lives and what they want to, and then how they use that. And some of it, it gets people make driven by profit, establish huge businesses on that. That's a really big direction these days in mental health even. And so we have to really basically define. So do you have any, even at least on the personal level, a definition of truth? How we can, if we seek truth, what that should be?
That's a tough one. That puts me on the hot seat. But let me say this. Yeah, for many, many years, I've often wondered if there's any such thing as an objective, what I say, a capital T truth, or if it's just all lowercase t truth. Now, it's probably both, because I tend to try and be non-dualist. And, kind of yin yang, it's black and white, it's yes and no, it's not either or, it's yes and. So I think both are true. There's objective truth and subjective truth. And I think the best way that I've come to realize that, I do think in some cases there is an objective T truth, are usually the things that are not, capital T truth are the things that are mostly not created by humans. Nature, consciousness itself, that's a capital T truth. Look at the stars, look at the universe, look at the sun, look at the constellations, and consciousness itself. I think those types of things are the capital T objective truths. When it comes down to mankind and human beings, that gets a lot stickier because those things tend not to last forever, and then of course get distorted and et cetera, et cetera.
Even though just simply the topic of consciousness, really just beginning to understand some things about it, in terms of, what's truth. And a lot of those explorations of consciousness are subjective, and now there is in science a lot of scientific studies as well, but that still it's not, I think it's hard to take that as a reference. Actually, when I moved into the neuroscience field as a researcher more than 15 years ago, that was the first topic I wanted to study, consciousness. And I rejected the idea for a very practical reason, because back then it was before psychedelics became so popular, just openly. There were just very little that we could do. I could have done at the time to study consciousness with objective, like scientific method. And so that's why I decided to work on something else. But now it all comes full circle. So we are having these conversations. So in terms of mental health, because I'm very interested in mental health implications and our audience in general. So which mental health implications of psychedelics are you the most excited about or most curious about right now?
Well, obviously there are an absolute ton. The two that interest me the most are for opioid addiction. There's a lot of research being done around ibogaine, for example, because ibogaine is particularly effective in treating opioid addiction, which is obviously a crisis across the United States right now with fentanyl.
And alcohol as well. That's another, actually, even more studies, ibogaine.
Yeah. And then the other one that I find interesting as well is psychedelics for things for the elderly, for Alzheimer's and dementia. There's some interesting things happening around that as well. I'm no expert in Alzheimer's and dementia by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think there's been an effective treatment for that. I think maybe the possibilities of neuroplasticity that psychedelics can offer are providing, hope to stave off the effects or maybe even preempt dementia and Alzheimer's, which are absolutely just horrible, debilitating diseases.
And apparently there is a lot of interest from the elderly. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. I will shameless self-promo here. There will be a blog coming out on globalpsychedelicweek.com in the near future, which of course I helped run the blog on Global Psychedelic Week. I did an interview with Matthew Lowe not long ago. I believe he works with Unlimited Sciences. There was a phone number that he helped create last year. That was a psychedelic educational hotline. And this will be in the interview when it comes out. But I asked him, what was the most interesting thing you learned from the opening of that educational hotline for psychedelics? And I think he said, if I'm not mistaken, that over 40% of the callers were elderly, which is simultaneously shocking, beautiful, and just intriguing. I think this is something that is largely maybe either just off the radar, ignored, I don't know, but I think that's a very fascinating area of investigation. Why do elderly people have this surging interest in psychedelics? I have some ideas, but I think that's something that we should be more conscious and cognizant of, because I think that's a growing demographic segment of psychedelic interest.
So why do you think they are interested in?
I think one possibility is that this last, let's say the post-World War II era in the West has kind of reached peak rational materialism. Mm-hmm. We've been living under this framework, this context of reality in terms of rational materialism since, I say, the apple hit Newton in the head, for the past several centuries or so. And I think elderly people are, pun intended, maybe waking up to the fact that they've been missing something in their life. They've maybe been missing connection to their soul, discovering their soul, their spirit, whatever you want to call it. And as they reach the end of their life, they don't want to leave that stone unturned. They want to explore that and connect to that. And maybe a lot of them have friends or family that they've watched die that haven't done that, and maybe have struggled with end of life anxiety. And maybe they've looked into research by people in this space studying end of life anxiety. One of my favorites is Anthony Bossis. I believe he works at NYU and researches psychedelics and end of life anxiety. And there's just huge success in data to support it, the efficacy of how psychedelics can either drastically reduce or outright eliminate end-of-life anxiety. So that could be one of the big things pushing psychedelic interest among the elderly and over 65 demographic.
I was actually involved as a consultant in one of the NYU studies, so that was focused on not necessarily only elderly, it was more terminal illness. So most of the subjects were cancer patients with terminal cancer diagnosis. And of course, large number of them were elderly just because cancer tends to be more common later in life. And so I consulted with that study, and it was very interesting. So we even started discussing looking at, because they had a protocol for psychedelic therapy that they applied to those patients, and so we started discussing how we could study what happens biologically, because I'm a biologist, and so I worked with them to develop a direction for that. So there are now many studies, even on the biology level, and it's very interesting because you mentioned dementia and Alzheimer's, and so I think many of these people get interested because it's just it's just human nature. It's just so hard to face death, the prospect of death, whether or not we are old or young. So that's part of the reason, and maybe also because some of those people, most of them are probably retired and they have more freedom, to explore, probably.
Yeah, and I think maybe also they're finally allowing themselves a little bit of room and space to play.
Related.
I think that's something that's particularly been ignored in the United States, this freedom as adults to play. We've always been work to our own detriment. We live to work in the United States, which I think is very, very detrimental for Americans. And I think psychedelics obviously give people that opportunity to play again. And then the elderly find out that maybe they've disregarded that aspect of their lives. And then so it can not only, maybe help with health and maybe help with the process of facing mortality and end of life anxiety, but also at the same time, there's an aspect of play that's involved with exploring your consciousness and having experiences of awe. Because the other thing that I've seen over recent years that elderly people are doing a little bit of is using float tanks or sensory deprivation.
Yeah, I tried that a couple of times.
Yeah, I used to do it a lot. I love those. I think they're all a great tool for psychonauts and consciousness exploration as well. I would use a float tank every day. And it's very interesting, if I could, it's very interesting. There's some videos of elderly people giving their accounts on YouTube of their float tank experiences. And they come out, they're like grandmas, and they got white hair and glasses, and they love it. They absolutely love it. And it's so cool because it just shatters stereotypes. I mean, who would think that an old grandma would love a float tank?
Yeah, so it's just good in general that they are open to it. And then how about some more, because there are so many applications, and I know that you write about fringe topics. So can you share maybe one or two of those?
Yeah, well, I think we can kind of go back to something again that we were talking about in our LinkedIn thread earlier, about spiritual emergence. And on the graphic you shared, it was spiritual emergence, and then I think spiritual psychosis. So these things are appearing to happen more. A very credible person with all kinds of expertise and decades of experience in this area recently told me that these experiences may not be happening more, but they appear to happen more because now we have the freedom in our society to discuss them, because there's less stigmatization of mental health and it's less taboo. But these experiences are fascinating. I had one myself while I was integrating after my first 5-MeO DMT experience here in Mexico. And I seem to have experienced a kind of psychic opening. And one of the symptoms of a psychic opening are synchronicities. And after I had my 5-MeO DMT experience, I had the wildest, most improbable, potent chain of synchronicities over the next 6 or 7 months. At some point in the future, I'm going to write about this, but one I happened to calculate the odds of with the help of AI, which was really interesting. And one of the synchronicities I had was one in between 10 to 15 billion with a B, which means that it was way beyond any kind of lottery winning odds. I mean, pick the biggest, most improbable lottery in the world, and it was probably like 5x, 10x, 20x more improbable. So these experiences are extremely powerful and can be awesome, both beautiful and terrifying at the same time, because I was really starting to question my own sanity. Because in my case with these synchronicities, it started to challenge the subject-object relationship. Because I had synchronicities happen to me before, some pretty strong ones as well. And I've read Carl Jung's book about synchronicity, so very, very familiar with them already, but never to this level of potency and this frequency. And it started freaking me out. And as I was I was traveling across Mexico at the time, and as they were happening, I was asking myself, why are these happening to me? And I said, no, they're not happening to me. And then I said, why are these happening for me? And I said, no, they're not happening for me. And then I finally arrived at the correct answer is they are happening with me. So that subject-object relationship dissolves. That's just one example of spiritual emergence. And there are many, many different examples. But like I said, that line between, like what I said on your LinkedIn post, that line between emergence and spiritual emergency, spiritual psychosis is just as thin as a thread. And it's the old Joseph Campbell line that I forgot it already. The mystic swims with delight in the same waters that the psychotic drowns in.
Yeah.
So these spaces are liminal spaces between our baseline consciousness and then outside the bookends of consciousness, and they can be extremely insightful and helpful and at the same time destabilizing. So we really, really have to be careful to try and couch these experiences in a setting, in a physical setting that allows it to play itself out in a comfortable manner that doesn't threaten our health to any further degree.
Yeah, the synchronicities, I'm very interested in that. Actually, I've always been very interested in that because for some reason I'm kind of very receptive to them, and my whole life, I don't know where it came from. Somehow my brain must be wired for it or something like that before I started ever use psychedelics. One thing that I sometimes try to really figure out, look at it really critically, are those synchronicities really actually things that are connected, or is it because the other possibility is that if we are on the lookout for synchronicities, then we will find everywhere because we project. As humans, we are very prone to projection. That's one of the most common even psychological defense mechanisms, or that prompts us to explore. And do you have any thoughts about this? So how, because it's speaking about the difference between spiritual emergence or spiritual experience that is positive and, bypassing or psychosis or negative states. And, that's almost always part of it, that people experience these synchronicities, these meaningful coincidences, we call synchronicities, I guess. So how do you look at when you see that your 5-MeO DMT experience increased the number of synchronicities that you faced, that you came across? How do you decide if it's really? How do you look at it critically? Is it really? It's just really something meaningful, or is your momentary projection?
I think there's a lot of ways to do that, but I can provide one example that does that quite well. If somebody's on social media and you're in, a group or on a page or in a thread, Reddit or whatever, in discussions about in around synchronicities, some of the most popular things that come up is that, people see certain numerical patterns.
Mhm.
They look at the clock and they see certain numbers, or they look at the radio, or they're in their car, or they hear it in a song or a show on TV, whatever. And I don't know if these are synchronicities or not. I think a lot of them can be, and I think a lot of them aren't. That in this case, when it comes to numbers, in a lot of ways, people can find those things and ascribe meaning to them when it is not meaningful. It's just random. Every day the clock is going to say 12:12 twice.
Yeah.
So I think to some extent that people are looking for meaning in places where it's not. However, when I had this chain of synchronicities happen to me in Mexico, I have two really good examples, but I'll give one of them. I was in a town in Mexico called 𝘁cie𝗽𝗶𝗰𝗀, and I was in a bar, and I met the owner. I was talking with the owner, and he was originally from Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago. We start talking. We find out that we're both basically from the same neighborhood, and we're talking more and more, and the world is shrinking. And then I finally tell him where I went to grammar school, and he said, "Oh my God, do you know Philip so-and-so?" And I said, "Yeah, I went to grammar school with him." And he looked at me like he saw a ghost, and he said, "That's my best friend." And so, I mean, that's not something you can see physically, like a number on a clock. That's invisible. There's no doubt that's a gigantic synchronicity. You're in a foreign country and you meet a random stranger who's best friends with somebody you went to grammar school with. I mean, that's impossible. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. In that case, it's a synchronicity. But where that boundary is cut off between a true synchronicity and then ones that aren't, where people maybe see things and ascribe meaning to them that maybe it's just random. Things happen every day. Like a clock will say the same number twice a day. I think people just get really excited about this idea, and then they're looking for it. And when you actually kind of look for them before you truly experience them, you'll see them where they're maybe not. But once you really understand what a synchronicity is, and you can kind of tune in your consciousness to it, you will see them everywhere. I mean, Carl Jung has talked about that. You train your consciousness and you will see them everywhere. And, as I've said, I forgot if it was maybe Carlos Castaneda or who it was, kind of, I think developed this little idea that they're kind of like the lights on a runway, that a plane will land on or take off from. They're little synchronicities, are little hints or clues that and support that you're on the right path in life.
I'm just sometimes I hear from people, especially just right after they had a really big, meaningful psychedelic experience, just like you said, that they suddenly see so many synchronicities, and I hear that they experience like 30, 40 synchronicities per day, and to me that's overwhelming. I would go crazy. So I don't know.
It's possible.
That's why it's almost like there is nothing else then. So that's why it's so, and that they are so focused on it, and then their whole life becomes centered around it. And I think this is exactly one good example how it can get out of hand and lead to almost this psychotic-like states, because then maybe a lot of it is really real, but they invite and they project.
Yeah, there's risk of that as well. There's an idea that I love, which is pronoia, the opposite of paranoia. Pronoia is the idea that the universe is secretly conspiring to shower you with blessings. So I think, you could almost go into a spiritual psychosis or emergency from too much positivity almost. You start seeing synchronicities everywhere. And and that's dangerous, because when you do flirt with the mystical and you experience this profound richness and mystical aspect of the universe and realize that it's real, you could also go down that path. You might think that when you experience the positive, it won't risk destabilizing you, but it can also do that.
This is actually these types of cases are some of the cases that I have come across recently. A lot of them that people, even I think it's very much in public awareness, because people coin this term, like even you mentioned that the positive, just trying to look at everything positive, and we coined social media coined this term toxic positivity, and I'm sure you know what that means. And there is definitely, and there are debates over it. Is it do we need to worry about? Is it a good thing and so on. But again, it's just like, it's just where to draw the line and how to find balance, because
Yeah, and toxic positivity.
some of the red flags when I talk to people about these types of things, when I constantly just hear, anything, I come up with a critical observation, or, not harshly, not rude, not being rude, but, just stating something. And even that they don't want to accept as a problem. Basically, I'm seeing problems that you're just completely denying problems. That's exactly like textbook case of spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, and toxic positivity, I think, it's just another, it's a synonym for spiritual bypassing, and it's something that's very common in the conscious community. I've been to Burning Man once. I saw that a little bit out at Burning Man. There's this kind of idea of like, just chill, bro. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. And I kind of think of it in terms of parents who stifle or maybe try and put a lid on the emotions or emotional reactions of their children. Of course, there are times when children need to have a lid on their emotions, but then there's other times when parents might just not allow them to express an emotion. And that's just as bad, to not be able to have the space or the freedom to express emotions. And I think that's what toxic positivity does, is it's basically saying, oh no, that emotion is not okay. And I tend to think that every feeling, every and any emotion is okay, but manifesting that emotion may not be okay. It's okay to feel angry. Don't be angry, which is to say, like, don't smash stuff, don't throw stuff, don't lose control over your behavior. But yes, go ahead and feel it, feel all of it. But the toxic positivity doesn't let us do this, and I don't think that's healthy.
Yeah, anger is specifically, many people talk about it as a symptom, anger as emotion. It's like, it's just like a symptom, and we have to look underneath because it's just a signal to other things. But going back to the psychedelics, so there are so many substances these days. What do you see? Is there anything, or maybe a couple of them, that you see having the highest potential for raising awareness, healing mental health issues, traumas, and so on?
Well, I think that iboga and ibogaine is going to be really, really good for substance use disorder, whether opioids, alcohol, tobacco even. So I think that's promising. And then the other one that is very, very intriguing and fascinating, getting away from the healing aspect of psychedelics, is DMT.
Mm-hmm.
There's a new study being done now. Well, there's the DMT-X studies. If anybody doesn't know about that, the X stands for extended. And these have been, I think, conducted in Imperial College of London, where patients and volunteers have been put under DMT intravenously with an infusion for hours.
That's what I did. That's how I was a subject.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, what's going to be found through that? Who knows? Who knows? You want to talk about psychonaut and explorations of consciousness, but also there's another study being done, I think it's at the University of Florida, and I think the neuroscientist Andrew Gallimore is helping with this, is the study of endo-DMT. They're trying, okay, I should say before this, there's DMT in the human body. 20, 30 years ago, when I first started doing psychedelics, there was this kind of story, idea, maybe legend, maybe it's a little bit urban myth, some mix of all of them, that DMT comes from the pineal gland. Now, this has not been proven. We don't know this. However, we do know now that there are traces of DMT in the human body, but we still haven't quite figured out where it comes from. It might come from, I think people say, the lungs. I think I've heard also the kidneys or something like this, but it is in the human body. So now the University of Florida is trying to study find some way to activate endogenous DMT in the human body, I think by studying peptides. And this is incredible. And a very, very good example of how science and spirituality are merging. So it could be possible within the next few years, definitely within our lifetime, that we find some method to turn on endogenous DMT in our bodies. And that is going to be more than groundbreaking. It's going to be consciousness shattering.
In terms of the how it was detected, first DMT, endogenous DMT, and I think in many of the studies, the original studies, could never really show DMT directly in the human body. It was more looking at enzymes that are involved in the metabolism of DMT, and they were induced under certain conditions, and so that's how it was more like a speculation. But people are now looking much more into it. And do you think that if you start using this, it's basically inducing endogenous DMT, if there is such a thing, do you think there are risks associated with that?
Oh, I think there's going to be some risk. And of course, with any new, if this is considered a technology, which I think Andrew Gallimore says is that DMT is a type of technology, there's always risks with new technology. And I think in this case, the risks will be quite unique and quite different. If a way to activate endogenous DMT is discovered using peptides, I'm assuming, which is always dangerous, but let's just for the sake of the argument assume that this is going to be a very natural, organic process. I don't think there's going to be much of a risk of health in terms of physical health. The two risks that I possibly foresee is one, is it becoming like what could happen in the near future with VR. Kind of a Black Mirror episode where people are living in another world and then just lose all connection to this world. Yeah. And then they spend so much time in that other world that when they try coming back to this world, they've just lost all of their grounding and don't know how to navigate or operate in this world anymore. And then the other thing is, we don't know what that other world is. We call it consciousness. It's absolutely consciousness, but that doesn't mean everything in that world is benevolent. It doesn't mean everything is, what I would call Lucky Charms, marshmallows. It's not going to necessarily, nobody knows that there's any guarantee that it's all, rainbows, four-leaf clovers, and unicorns. You could be messing with some very, very malevolent forces on the other side of that thin veil of consciousness. There's wild conversations that are coming out around DMT now and entities, and this crossover with DMT entities and aliens, and now even people talking about angels and demons. If we activate endogenous DMT and then start, I don't know, just for sake of the argument, start playing around with demons or something, I don't think that's going to be very good, but we shall see what happens.
But even on the biological level, so I'm a biologist, so I like to look at that aspect of things. And so if we take a drug, external DMT, like a substance, then we know very well that usually it's very short acting, unless it's in the form of ayahuasca or that infusion in a lab environment. And then we know that it will subside, and then we can go back to kind of, even if we gain something from that experience, but we regain more or less our original consciousness. But my fear about this biohacking type of manipulations is that we don't know. We really have to study, for example, long-term effects. Are there, the timeline, and are there long-term effects? It's very often when it's the whole pharmaceutical industry, and whether it's, inducing something endogenous or giving people external drugs. The whole industry doesn't like to look at long-term effects. Still, I'm never saying that these studies are not worth doing. It's just, they have to be run carefully.
There's one little interesting possibility that might surface from this in the near future. I can't remember the name, but I believe there's a retreat in the Caribbean on an island that's is going to be or already offering extended DMTX to go there for a week or whatever. And I can't wait until some of those first people come out and do interviews to hear about these experiences and then how they feel, mentally, physically, spiritually. And then maybe that'll present an opportunity for research to maybe study the long-term effects or efficacy or whatever of these extended DMT experiences. And I think that'll be a fascinating area for research in the near future.
So another topic that I'm very interested in about psychedelics is potential use cases in prevention. So do you see anything promising going on in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In a classic case of as I say, shit grows flowers. Some fascinating, beautiful research came out of a tragedy, which was the Nova Festival in Israel. There was a lot of study done of the festival goers. Nova was a electronic music festival in Israel that was, suffered the attack by the Hamas gunmen back in 2023. I believe it was October 7th. And everybody at the festival, of course, suffered just an absolute tragedy and, trauma beyond our imagination. And of course, a lot of people, because it was an electronic music festival, were under the influence of psychedelics at the time. The people in Israel took advantage of this and decided to conduct a study of the festival goers in the wake of this tragedy and the attack. And they found that the people that were under the influence of MDMA at the time of the festival suffered less trauma in the wake of that event. So it did prove that MDMA has some kind of shielding effect for trauma, that maybe it doesn't have to be just used a long time after the trauma in terms of psychedelic assisted therapy, that maybe even in a very short time frame directly after a traumatic event, if MDMA is used, that it can be just as efficacious at that period as well.
I actually followed those studies, the NOVA studies. I even know someone who was involved in running those studies. They look at the others as well. I think they found that MDMA was the most effective, and they looked at LSD as well. And interestingly, another drug, alcohol, which is not a psychedelic per se, but so they looked at many people who were drinking, and those tended to have the opposite outcomes. So they had, they experienced more, more robust, more disturbing PTSD trauma symptoms. That's actually quite interesting. That was quite interesting to me because I had a personal experience once, not with MDMA or LSD, but with alcohol. And I just happened to be, I was walking on a street in a city in the middle of the day, and I got mugged by two guys, and they, stole everything from me, my money and my credit cards, my ID and everything. It was very scary because they also threatened me. And that was the only time in my life when an experience like that, some kind of very scary situation ended up causing really lasting, very classic PTSD symptoms, but I still denied it in the beginning. I definitely put myself in quite interesting situations because I'm a big novelty seeker and I don't mind risks. So that was not the only situation in my life, but none of the others were associated with that. So I don't think that I'm even prone to PTSD probably, but it was so hard to get rid of.
That's a life well lived. I've had a similar experience while using MDMA. I was out at night, and where I was at, there was a shooting very close nearby, and I was in a bar with about 100 people, and everybody ended up on their stomach on the floor. Because nobody knew how close the gunshots were, where they were coming from. And so, of course, I ended up on the floor on my stomach too. A whole lot of time in my mind passed in a few seconds. And the first thing I realized was that there was no stampede. Nobody was running. I didn't hear breaking glass or bottles or glasses hitting the floor. So I kind of quickly deduced that it wasn't happening in the bar. I didn't hear any other screams or shouting or anything. And then I suddenly realized after that, as everybody was crawling on their stomach to the back of the bar like they were in boot camp or something, I suddenly quickly realized, wait, there's no immediate danger here. And then I immediately realized, wait a minute, I'm not even afraid right now. I don't feel fear right now. And I was kind of laughing. I mean, I really was laughing and smiling. And then, in the wake of the incident, everything was fine, at least for me and some of the people that are with. There was a shooting outside, right down the block in the intersection. I continued my night like nothing had happened. But then in the days and weeks following, I kind of realized, oh, wow, not that I'm some tough guy or anything, but I breezed through it maybe because of the MDMA, because, it works on your amygdala, which is your fight, flight, or fight center of your brain, and that maybe the MDMA acted to kind of prevent trauma and, you know, preempt fear. So I was like, oh, wow, maybe maybe MDMA can prevent trauma. Now, we don't know when trauma comes, so we can't exactly like use MDMA ahead of trauma, but it's a very, very fascinating idea that it can maybe be proactive instead of just reactive.
Yeah, it's almost like developing something like the morning after pill
Yes. Yeah.
for trauma, right? And then
I wrote an article about trauma, and about this, and I said, you know, maybe it could be an idea in the future that, you know, say, for example, when there's a mass trauma event, like a natural disaster, maybe these people very quickly afterwards could be whisked to some kind of very comfortable trauma center with a beautiful setting where they can relax, and then maybe use something like MDMA to prevent any kind of trauma from being imprinted. You know, maybe not have an ambulance show up, maybe have some very comfortable, I don't know what, van, bus, whatever, and then take you out maybe into nature or some center where it's very comfortable, inviting, warm, you feel safe, and then you use MDMA, and then it will just totally be a proactive measure to prevent trauma from ever even happening.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And for me, it's also, again, from the point of view of how that works. And you mentioned the amygdala, you know, activity, the effects on that. I was actually involved in studies directly looking at neuroplasticity, but not only that, but also another type of plasticity, which is epigenetics, you know, changing gene expression. And there are now studies coming. Even a few years ago, there was almost nothing. It was more like, you know, I had this idea, I wanted to start a study, and now there is evidence that they can some of these substances can affect those epigenetic.
Yeah, I just saw a fascinating article. I haven't had time to read it yet. I got it saved in my homework file. I just saw an article that said there was a study that found something out about epigenetics, and I just learned about epigenetics, I don't know, I think about 10 or maybe 8 years or so ago, and that's an absolutely fascinating area of scientific study and research. But this article that I found said that there's some study that found or proved that there are epigenetic markers of trauma that sperm carry. And that's could be the mechanism of how trauma is passed down through generations, that it's imprinted epigenetically in the DNA and then carried by sperm. And I was like, wow.
So actually, this type of studies that was one of my main research topics when I was an academic, and we were looking at. So most of it was focused not on MDMA or on classic psychedelics, but we did a lot of studies with cannabis compounds like THC mostly. That's also, you know, some people even consider it as a psychedelic. And then, we were looking at these intergenerational effects, both on the behavioral level, on the, you know, emotional behavioral level, and then looking at the biological mechanisms, and then trying to figure out the transmission. And we had a study, it's still ongoing. It's looking at the effects of THC on THC users on their sperm. There are many different epigenetic mechanisms, so that we also need to figure out where to look. That whole like early life trauma and how that affects, you know, can lead to mental health issues later in life, or the intergenerational effects. A lot of that is now known to be epigenetic, and you know, if we can use that for prevention as well, because MDMA, let's say, affects, you know, the brain in the moment of the trauma, or during that window, it opens up a window of what we call a developmental biology sensitive windows, the windows of development that close down as we mature. But these substances can, through affecting neuroplasticity and things like that, they kind of open up a window. Maybe that's the mechanism of action. I'm just always a bit, again, it's just like I mentioned before, I like to think about risks, also potential risks, especially in this situation when we try to kind of manipulate. Don't you think that it could be abused very easily? Let's say we have a pill that makes us so resilient that, we can go into the war and we can go into the most violent situations and come out,
Okay, let me circle back around to that. But going back to the previous point about epigenetics, there's a really interesting way to tie this all together. For anyone that doesn't know what epigenetics are, let's see, it's the nurture versus nature, but it's what you experience in nurture that then becomes imprinted into nature. Would that be a good way? Like your experiences in life that then become imprinted onto your DNA. Is that a fair description of epigenetics?
Yeah, that's part of it. So the environmental effects, I think that's you mean by nurture, and nature is usually what is, let's say, inherited, what is given, and the nurture is the effect of external effects.
Exactly. So
when I study epigenetics, the way we define it, it's on the level of molecular biology, is that all those mechanisms that affect how the DNA, the genes are regulated. It's not the DNA that is given that we inherit, but how that DNA functions in the
yeah. So to bring this full circle, I think that gets back to one of the earliest points I was making in our conversation, that the systems that we're living in are causing the trauma. That's the nurture that's causing the trauma that then leads to that epigenetic effect. So that's the importance of changing the systems that we live in, because it's the setting of the world that we live in that is then producing that negative epigenetic traumatic marker in our DNA. So that really brings this all together. And then to answer your second question, yeah, I think this possibility of trauma to, act as, I guess you could maybe even say a prophylactic or a shield or a preventative measure of trauma, they're already being used in kind of devious ways. I've written a little bit about this on Substack, and in some pieces I've written about. There's military uses of this already in play. That is not good. And I'm not talking about like healing people with PTSD afterwards. That's all fine. That's beautiful. I love that. But I'm talking like on the battlefield itself. And I think there's already been some evidence of this in Ukraine, not with MDMA, but I think like 5-MeO or something. They're using the soldiers in the Ukraine. I forgot which side. I think it's Ukrainians, but they're using some kind of psychedelic. They get like what, a 1-day break or maybe 10 hours off the front line. They go and use whatever, and then they go right back. So this is, anything exactly. But good. It's not good at all.
And it will then become, it's easy to see how it will turn into a, huge business, and then,
yeah,
companies.
Yeah, and it kind of feeds then, the military-industrial complex, whether you're in the military or on the receiving end of the effects of war. And yet then putting psychedelics in the middle of that then just continues that cycle and just keeps creating and causing more trauma.
Even on the individual level, for example, again, like a personal story is that, so I mentioned that I think I'm just prone to, I just like to, try new things, and that usually often involves some level of risk. So, and my profession and everything, I even know personally that I carry some of the genes that predispose to that type of novelty seeking and risk taking. So I was not surprised when I discovered it in my own DNA. So as someone who has that kind of background, I know that even without psychedelics, without external help to become even more resilient, basically what happens is that in the beginning of a new experience, we don't feel fear as acutely. It's not aversive, at least, or it fades very fast after the experience, and then we do it again, and another thing and another thing, and then those traumatic situations or stressful situations, the effects can accumulate over time, even if it doesn't even touch consciousness, because like we were discussing, the biological mechanisms, and those are affected, and at some point it can reach a level when it's it becomes a problem. So I think that's how actually my own personal history with mental health issues snowballed and escalated, and with I had addictions and other things. So I really learned this in the hard way. So personally, I'm very interested in psychedelics, and I'm open to experiences myself, but I'm very, very careful because of this history, because I know even from the past when I experimented that that I had sometimes hard time stopping. Even though we say psychedelics are not addictive in a classical sense because they don't tap into the dopamine system as much, but someone who with that type of background, it can just be even just out of curiosity, preoccupation.
I can see something coming in the near future. I don't know, maybe, but talking about your epigenetic, markers and maybe being predisposed to things. I was thinking about like ancestry.com and how people have been, giving their DNA to that. And then, artificial intelligence. And then maybe, who knows, in the near future, there could be a way through something akin to ancestry.com and DNA analysis to find information or do research on certain things that you might be predisposed to via epigenetics. That could be interesting. I think there's some big privacy issues around that, but that could be an interesting thing that's quite possible in the not too distant future.
So that's actually a lot of the studies that I was involved in, that I even led some of those studies. So that was exactly that type of study. It's just looking at the epigenetic mechanisms of those experiences, not with psychedelics again, but a lot of it was in relation to drugs and the cannabis.
And then I think there's another possibility, which is basically fixing it using something like CRISPR. That then you just go back and then use CRISPR and put your DNA into that, and then just you just fix it, and then you go on with your daily life.
Yeah, CRISPR is easier. It's currently I see more like direct potential because if you're familiar, that is targeted. That goes directly. You direct it to a specific gene. With epigenetic manipulations, it's very hard with the current methods to target epigenetic reversal and change to a specific region of the genome or the biological makeup. And so there are now pharmaceuticals, medications even that are being repurposed, that originally they were developed for some other illness, and then researchers found that they affect epigenetic regulation, and they are now being investigated as potential reversal agents. It can be a cure or.
Well, that makes for another possible interesting future study, people who heal from trauma. If there's any kind of data or records of what their epigenetics were like, or their markers, epigenetic markers prior to healing, and then afterwards, if they heal their trauma, does that alter their epigenetics, their epigenetic markers? Yeah. That could be an interesting future study as well.
That's exactly how we do those studies in humans. It's sometimes a bit tricky because some of the epigenetic mechanisms cannot be looked at in live humans, because we have to we're looking at the brain, so we have to take out the brain, right? So they die, and so
we'll have Neuralink for that. Neuralink will take care of that.
Yeah, maybe. There are some though that can be looked at from blood. There are epigenetic markers in blood, studies like the sperm studies, or from skin samples and things like that. One major method to do that is using animal models. So that's what we did a lot, is using lab animals where you can just model anything. And so Adam, this was so exciting, and I think I still feel that we could have maybe another 5 hours to
we could talk a long time. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the last question is, how can people learn more about you, find your work?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Adam Miezio on LinkedIn, and then also on Substack, adammiezio.substack.com. That's another good place to find me. You can also find me on my website, adammiezio.com. Those are the 3 best places. Oh, and one more, maybe if anybody's interested, Global Psychedelic Week. I write on the blog there a little bit. I do interviews with people in the psychedelic community and field around the world. And the event is coming up November 3rd through the 9th online, globally. So if you're interested more in psychedelics, come hang out for the week online and find out what's happening around the world, and maybe even in your own country, some new things you don't realize are happening.